Mr. O'Brien currently serves and has served since 1986 as the Executive Director of the Association of Chiropractic Colleges. From Bethesda, Maryland, would you welcome Mr. David O'Brien? David. By the way, one other detail. He had an opportunity last night to have dinner with Anton Scalia and gave that up to be here to be with us today. I told him he was nuts. Thank you.
Loyalty in Washington is relatively unknown, but Jerry and I have been good friends for years, and I said I'll be here. Well, being the man before lunch, I will make sure that we keep to the balance of my time that I've been allotted. My task today is to talk a little bit about the Supreme Court and its recent hearings that have been going on regarding the ACA law and how it's going to play out. That's something that's rather an interesting topic to begin to talk about because it's such an interesting place to be and to be from. This is the existing court that's hearing this. Does anybody notice anything interesting about that court? Well, we have 3 women on that court. We have 1 black gentleman on that court. But the thing that distinguishes that court, I believe, is I think for the first time in the history of the court, there aren't any Protestants on that court. Very different. 9 gentlemen starting this whole process back. One of the earliest things our country did in the 1790s. And it was in 1803 when Marbury versus Madison, they decided that they did have jurisdiction to oversee and decide the constitutionality of congressional court actions. And since that time, the court has heard a variety of cases. And the one that you heard that we had in March for 3 days was really one that was unprecedented. Generally, you have an opportunity to appear before the court. You've got your 9 justices, and they can decide or not decide to take a case. And generally, if you have your various appellate courts coming up with different opinions, the Supreme Court can decide to take a case or decline to take it. So the 9 justices received 26 state petitions to challenge the law. 150 amicus briefs were filed. Amicus briefs are friends of the court, people who have an interest in the case can proffer their own legal memorandum to the court for their consideration. And in this case, the court took up some of those amicus briefs and used them. They're very helpful when justices are writing their opinions. And you have everybody across the board was involved in this 150 briefs, from the American Cancer Society to your Federation of Small Businesses and other such organizations. But you've got your executive branch and your legislative branch making the decisions, and the courts overseeing what is and is not permissible under the Constitution. One of the various problems that you have when you go into court as an attorney, when you go before the appellate system in our country, judges are sitting there. You might have one judge or several judges on your panel. And as an attorney, you would go before that court. You would be arguing not the facts in the case. At this level, at the appellate level, you're only arguing the law and the legal cases and whether the lower court made it a proper determination. In that case, you will, as a lawyer, would go back and brief the cases, come up with your legal arguments, send them into the court, and also footnote all of the legal cases which are your precedents that you believe are apropos. And as the case here, I can take notes with me. When you go to the next level, to the Supreme Court, you are normally given 20 minutes, you have no notes, and you speak extemporaneously on the message that you want to deliver to the court. Now that sounds like it's very reasonable. 20 minutes, you can get up, think you have 10 points that you want to make. You can make those 10 points. But in the Supreme Court, that's not the tradition that guides. As soon as you open your mouth, a justice will start blaring out questions. On page 73 of your brief, you talked about Schechter case in 1935. How is that applicable in this case? Well, wait a minute, before you answer that, I want to hear on page 13, you talked about, and this person has to be eloquent on their feet, sharp in mind, legally precise. Because I will tell you what's been going on before the court ever appeared. The court has taken all of its clerks, gone through every single one of the 26 states, the 150 briefs, the amicus briefs, looked at all the cases they've cited, and go back, and the footnoted cases, they will go back and research. That's the kind of people, when you get an Anthony Scalia asking a question before the court, he will have done all that research before he asks his first question. So, we had various arguments. We've had very different results. We've had one court that overturned the entire case. You had a case here in Atlanta, Georgia, in one of the courts that said they threw out the mandate, but the rest of the law stood the test. So we're faced with some very interesting discussions of how we're going to go up and answer this next stage in the arguments that the court has to deal with. Normally, you have your 20 minutes of oral arguments, and then you're through. That's not how they designed this case. They said, I'm going to have 2 hours or so of open argument, discussion before the court. We will do it day 1, day 2, day 3. Very unusual for the court. And you had those 3 issues. They divided up the days. The first day, they were going to decide whether the Anti-Injunction Act of 1867 was going to be applicable. That is, if this tax, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't come into play until 2015 when you pay taxes, is the case ripe for discussion? Should we have this discussion at all? And whether that was applicable or not. Now, you had a couple of people testifying, and I'm doing the things during that day, the attorneys presenting the case. Robert Long was one of them. The U.S. Solicitor General was a gentleman by the name of Roger Vinson, who has been the Solicitor General for the last several years. He had a good day that day, but in the course of the conversations, and if you recall that first day, 8 out of the 9 justices asked questions. Justice Clarence Thomas, I don't think has asked a question since he sat on the bench. He is very unusual, but he's keeping with his policy. He never asks questions during oral arguments, so you never have an idea what his questions might be in the case, but you recognize that his conservative viewpoints would probably win the day in the case, and that's where everybody assumes will be the case today. Verilli presented his case and went on from that first day, which basically people think will be decided that's not going to be applicable, that the case should be heard and the court will make some determinations. So day 2 was going to be whether the individual mandate was going to be upheld as constitutional. Now, at that point, Verilli regulates, he thought that this is just the purchasing of health care, whether this is a purchase, whether it was mandating, and the question for the court to look at is whether this is legal constitutionally under the Commerce Clause. Now, the Commerce Clause is one that's been used for some years. The justices, everybody broke into this discussion. The broccoli possibility was, well, can the government order you to eat broccoli every day if they can order you to buy insurance? Can you create commerce in order to regulate it, was Justice Kennedy. One of the interesting things that the attorneys in the world look at, they're looking at this case totally differently than the rest of us in this audience are looking at it. Their whole thing is, what will the court say about the Commerce Clause and its strength, and how will that imply all the other clients that I have? They have nothing to do with health care, but in terms of where the courts go. I can tell you this, the courts, I think the last time the courts found that it didn't apply was Schechter versus the United States, a 1935 case having to do with poultry and sick poultry being transported interstate. That was the last time that the Commerce Clause was narrowly construed. For the past 70 years, the courts have been generally quite generous with that. And one of the things that we find in that discussion was all the questions that came across the field. Now, people before, the pundits of the world were saying before the case came up, they thought, well, that the law would survive, and that the law would somehow, even if the mandate fell, that the case would go forward. Based upon the discussion of day 2, I think Verilli had a cold that day. He did not start off well in his presentation and never regained his footing. It's hard to do when you've got questions being peppered at you. People who you may think are favorable to you will ask you penetrating questions because they want to have that information and your response so they can write it up in any legal opinion that they're going to write up later. So you may find people like the two swing people that are in this court would be Roberts and Kennedy as a group. And Kennedy was probing. Roberts asked questions on both sides of the issue. They were asking these questions so that these are the questions that may be most troubling to them, or they want your answer in the case file for them to be able to write their legal opinions on later, either agreeing or disagreeing with you. And that's certainly the case in this. But how this plays out is going to be a different thing, and I'll mention that in a minute. So as we get to all these, you had different people being able to make their presentations. Michael Carvin was there. Now, the way the court at this point is make up and all the pundits at the end of day 2, this is sort of like hearing the halftime score. They figure that Scalia, Alito, Kennedy, and Roberts and Thomas, if they would make up a court majority, that leaving Ginsburg, Breyer, Sotomayor, and Kagan all in favor of the act and keeping it as it is. The courts generally, in big cases, like to be forthcoming in a substantial matter. So it's not a clearly divided case. It's a court that has some substance. And this is going to play out over the next couple of days and the next couple of months as we look at this case. The third day that came out was whether they could, the act could continue to stand if they took the mandate out. And what you would end up with was a hollow shell. Paul Clement gave the brilliant arguments for the 26 petitioners representing the state attorney generals across the country. Paul Clement is a former Solicitor General himself. He's only 45. A decade ago, at 35, he was the Solicitor General of the United States. A brilliant legal mind who can get up and talk extemporaneously and give you clear citations on legal cases and precedents all the way through. He did a brilliant job on day 2 and was a clearly superior presentation from all the attorneys that presented. Paul Clement, I can tell you, is a former law clerk of Justice Scalia and has done quite an interesting legal career in Washington for somebody who is so young. It's nice to see people who have great minds working in public policy. Whether you agree with them or disagree with them, it's good to have people that are good critical thinking skills that can talk about these things. So we go on. We've got these 24 cases that challenge the law, and I mentioned the one court that declared it entire law undone in the Atlanta case. In a sidebar last week, President Obama was speaking about the case and said the court shouldn't intervene in this. And it was a legal case that had to do with this act that was going through the courts, the appellate courts in Texas. And Judge Jerry Smith from Texas was incensed by reading the newspapers that Obama had made the comment that he inferred that the court had no jurisdiction to overturn acts of Congress. And so he stopped the court case and said, I want a 3-page, single-space brief from the Attorney General of the United States telling me what the President and the administration's positions are on whether the court has jurisdiction over hearing cases. I thought, the legal people that are in the room, quite unusual for a court to do that. He shouldn't be reading the newspapers and applying it into the case. Normally that's not what's the best practices of judicial procedure. But he was a Reagan appointee, and you see more political opinions coming up in court cases than we should have, in my humble opinion. And I should say from the outset, these are my opinions and not anybody else's. It's not the associations that I work for. And so when I do my peeking around the curtains, this is what the court case looks like. You had people lining up outside for days before the court hearings. And it's not a comfortable seat to sitting in for these the benches of the court. You might know that these things in Washington are always done differently than they do every place else. We pay people to sit in line for us, so I may pay for you to go sit in line for me so that I can get into a hearing before Congress or for a court case. So you have people that are lined up, and you got all these people, and then you think, what would their interest be in this court? It looks like a homeless person. And there he is sitting there for 3 days, but you hear this case. And then you have an impeccably dressed lawyer come up and thank you very much and go in and take his seat at the court. So that's what's going on inside Washington as we talk here. The court's tradition generally are to provide a little bit of oversight. Have I taken myself out of context here? But Oliver Wendell Holmes, a quote here, "Beware how you take away hope from another human being." Oliver Wendell Holmes was on the court for a short 30 years, from 1902 to 1932. He was appointed by Teddy Roosevelt, and when he retired, Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin, appointed Benjamin Cardozo to replace him on the court. But somebody who had a number of cases that he wrote for the court over his long tenure and his Harvard background. And I point that out because the courts tend to take a look at precedent and respond to that. This is what the courts have said. This is what most of the conservative jurists say when they're testifying before Congress on the confirmation hearings. And yet we see somewhat of an activist court, which may or may not be as traditional as we find it as we move forward through one or two of these cases. In the case of the court, we did have some people on day 3 that were friends of the court. That the court says, "Okay, I'm going to pick at you." Bart Farr is a lawyer in Washington. He said, "Your brief was very good. I want you to argue for the court for us on a position that people aren't taking, in terms of what can the law stand if the mandate goes out." And he argued effectively for the rest of the court could stand if the mandate was thrown out. And I said, invalidating the entire law is an example of the best driving out the good. And so now all the political people and all the lawyers in the world are now writing furiously about what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. And you had lots of different opinions that are coming up from this. The National Health Law Program came up and said Paul Clement, who I said was one of the premier lawyers, had 5 different mistakes in his presentation when talking about the Medicaid program. Medicaid program is different from Medicare, Medicare being the total federal program for retirees, Medicaid being a joint state-federal program where the states can add in elements to and benefits to the program, partially state-funded, partially federal-funded. And they were saying that in his arguments to the court, he was making some legal suppositions and citing wrong federal regulatory statute sections on the Medicaid law in order to present and enhance his arguments. When we do make these kind of arguments, you're always going to have a lawyer who can present the other side of the view. After all, that's our legal system. We have 2 sides for everything. It all depends on who your client happens to be that day that you can present. But the court's faced with this dilemma. Strike down the law, strike down the insurance mandate, or leave the law alone. And when you start to do that, there are a variety of things that begin to happen. And when these dominoes begin to fall, you begin to see how the court's actions do have an impact on everyday life and where we are. If a court says it's okay, you'll have the status quo. If it does go down, or parts of it go down, like the insurance mandate, the healthcare industry is going to be shaken up. Drug makers will make up costs as more people are insured. Health insurers will do the same. And if the bill is nullified, we're back where we were. However, price increases still go up that are not sustainable, and we still have the remaining problem that the government started out with to begin with. striking down the mandate would be somewhat of a disaster for us, no matter where we go, because we can't afford the increases to the system. And let me, for just a moment, start taking this back. When we started this whole health care debate in Washington several years ago, the big discussion, that's the White House, I'll call them back. When we started the debate, the whole discussion was about electronic medical records and how we all need to be keeping the same medical records, and if we do that, the insurance company said, oh, this is great. We'll have all the providers writing down all their notes. We won't have to employ all these people in the insurance business. That's great. We can go for that. We've just been able to get a nice increase on our rate of return. And of course, that was the beginning of the discussion to get some of the groups. We're going to take pharmaceutical benefits and add them across the board to 40 million more people. Pharma said, well, this is a pretty good deal. I'll go in on that. So when we started this process out, that was the focus of where the genesis of this, putting this healthcare bill up on these foundations based upon the drivers that we currently have, insurance and pharmaceutical benefits. We haven't heard much about electronic medical records since. Those of us in the education of our future healthcare providers, all of us need to be able to read each other's SOAP notes for us to be effective managers of care, providing referrals, and providing the care that we do. And that's still at its infancy. We're just beginning to talk about that across disciplines. And interprofessional educational opportunities are the big discussion within the health world that we have today. Will make a big impression on where we go. We do have some precedents in the Commerce Clause in terms of where the court may or may not go. They have recognized for some time that national problems require national solutions. The last big case was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I think it was. And in that arguing for the court in a 9-0 opinion, Justice Tom Clark wrote, it may be argued that Congress could pursue other methods to eliminate the obstructions it found in interstate commerce caused by racial discrimination. But this is a matter of policy that rests entirely with the Congress, not with the courts. Tom Clark writing for the unanimous court decision. Pretty powerful. That's been the law for 40 years. That's been the precedence that they've had. So, with all the questions that we've had, did the justices get it right? Kennedy did he get it right when he said the burden was on the defenders of the law in his opening question? Or did he get it wrong? Conservative justices seem to have no deference for the Congress at this point. They're going to make up their own decision, it would appear, being activist members of the court, which is something they're saying they're not. And this is a court, however, that said in the corporations have the same rights that people do in their 2010 Citizens United case. That has transformed the political market this way with all the super PACs that have, you don't know who contributes to them, and they are making independent decisions, and corporations can put any amount of money into them. So that's the court that we have that's looking at what we've got right here. Remember, this is a court also that gave us the 5-4 decision on the Gore versus Bush case in terms of who was elected in that presidential election. So, what are the immediate consequences if the court says they're doing this? Some of these laws don't impact us until 2014 or 2015. We have some laws, if any have kids that don't have jobs yet that are less than 26 years old that come home from college and you're living and still on the family payroll. Some of these things that are in the new law, those kind of things would go away if they did away with the mandates. Increased coverage for preventive services in the law. And currently, as you have some pre-wellness care and whatnot for children up till the age of 18 or 21. Other things will come into play in 2014. The birth control coverage that got the president in so much trouble, and he moved it from the employer to the insurance company in terms of who would pay for those kind of benefits. lifetime benefits that you now have, a lifetime exclusion of benefits, the expanded Medicare, and like every other law in Washington, we tack on things to it because it's a bill that's moving through, and they tacked on the Indian Health Care Act as well. That would fall if they did away with the whole law. So, I'm back to the beginning and back to the end of this report, and I know everybody is asking what it is that's going to happen. In June, the court will come up with its decision, and I have gone back to, I was on a call on day 3, in the afternoon of day 3, with a private White House call with the people who are working on this bill, and they said the president has no alternative plan. He believes the bill is going to be fully supported by the court. Now, my personal observation in the court, I think what may well happen, depending on the people, you've got your 4 and 4 cases potentially. If Kennedy decides to go with Ginsburg and the others and support the affirmation of the law, it may well be, which would make it a 5-4 decision, you may well have Chief Justice Roberts go with him and make it a 6-3 opinion. And the reason he would do that would be if he's in the majority, he gets to dictate who writes the opinion. And so it would guide the court's opinions on that and be able to say what the law is and how the courts and the members have interpreted it. If it goes and Kennedy goes the other way, the supposition is that Roberts would go the other way as well, still being able to write the majority. So, for those people that are of a certain age, I have consulted with many gurus in Washington about exactly what's going to happen. And so I went to the one who's never let me down, has always come up with the right answers for me. So I'm going to ask again later. I rest my case, Mr. Chairman.